Clara Whitfield pressed both hands flat against the trading post counter to keep them from shaking because her mother had just smiled at Gerald Holt and said, "She don't eat much. Not she works hard. Not she's a good girl. Just she don't eat much." Like Clara was a mule being sold before winter. Like 24 years of her life added up to how little she cost to keep. She didn't scream, she didn't run. She stood there and felt something inside her go very, very quiet. If that hit you, somewhere deep, subscribe to this channel and stay with Clara until the very last word. And drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1882 came to Harlan Creek, Montana, the way it always did, hard, bright, and without mercy. The kind of summer that dried up rivers and cracked open the earth and made men do things they would later claim they had no choice about. Clara Whitfield was 24 years old, and she had been doing things she had no choice about for as long as she could remember. She had been sewing since she was 7. By the time she was 12, she could hem a dress better than most grown women in the county. By 16, she had taken over her mother's mending work entirely, her small fingers moving through candlelight long after the rest of the house went quiet, her eyes straining, her back aching. Because if she did not finish the orders by morning, they would not eat. Her father had left when she was 9. He had not said goodbye. Her mother, Ruth Whitfield, had not cried about it. She had simply looked at Clara the next morning and said, "Well, looks like it's just us now." And Clara had. For 15 years she had worked. She had not complained. She had not asked for more than she was given. She had folded herself into whatever shape the world needed her to be, made herself small and quiet and useful, because she had understood from a very young age that the only thing that kept her safe was being necessary to someone. She just had not understood, until that summer morning, that even being necessary was not always enough. Ruth Whitfield arrived at the Harlan Creek trading post at 9:30 in the morning. And she brought Clara with her the way a woman brings a piece of furniture she intends to sell, not cruelly. Exactly, but without any particular tenderness either. The trading post was run by a man named Gerald Holt, and Gerald Holt was the kind of man who had a price for everything, and had never once in his 63 years assigned sentimental value to anything he could not weigh on a scale. Ruth had done business with Gerald before, small transactions. A bundle of mended shirts in exchange for flour, a repaired coat in exchange for salt pork. The mathematics of survival, conducted quietly between two people who understood that in a frontier town, you did not survive on pride. But this was different. Clara understood it was different the moment her mother did not tell her to wait outside. She understood it even more when Ruth smoothed the front of her dress, straightened her spine in the way she only did when she was steeling herself for something unpleasant, and pushed open the door of the trading post with Clara at her heel. Gerald Holt looked up from behind his counter. He looked at Ruth. Then his eyes moved to Clara, and something in that look, the way his gaze moved across her slowly, the way he seemed to be calculating, made Clara's stomach go cold. "Ruth," he said, "wasn't expecting you till Thursday." "Change of plans," her mother said. She set her hands flat on the counter. "You still looking for someone to cook and keep house? Your wife left, what, 2 months back?" Gerald's jaw tightened slightly. 2.5. "That's what I thought." Ruth nodded once, the way she always did when she had already decided something. "Clara's a good worker. You've seen her mending. She keeps a clean house. She's quiet. And she don't eat much." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Clara had ever heard. She stood very still. She did not move. She was not sure she was breathing. Because she understood now, fully, completely, without any room left for misunderstanding, exactly what was happening in this room. Her mother was not discussing work arrangements. Her mother was not negotiating a wage. Her mother was describing her, the way you describe a horse you're trying to sell at auction. "Quiet. Strong eat much, Mama," Clara said. Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "What are you doing?" Ruth did not look at her. "Hush, Clara. Grown folks are talking." Gerald leaned forward on the counter, studying Clara with the same expression he used when he was examining a bolt of cloth for flaws. "She's a bit thin. She's strong," Ruth said. "Thin don't mean weak. I'd need her full-time. She's available full-time. I'd pay a fair wage. Not much, but fair. I'm not asking for much," and drew out a small folded piece of paper. A list, Clara realized. A list of things she wanted: flour, salt, a side of bacon. The credit on my account cleared. She set the list on the counter. "That's all I'm asking." Gerald picked up the list. Read it, folded it again, and nodded. Clara's breath left her body. She felt the floor tilt. She felt the walls of that small trading post close in. She felt every year of her life, every candle burned down to nothing, every needle pushed through cloth in the dark. Every meal she had cooked, and every dress she had mended, and every morning she had risen before dawn to be useful collapse into the simple, terrible arithmetic of what her mother had just done. A sack of flour. Her mother had traded her for a sack of flour. And some salt, and credit cleared on an account, Mama. Her voice did not shake this time. It was very quiet, and very steady, and there was something in it that had never been there before, something that had no name yet, but felt like the very last moment before something breaks. "Look at me." Ruth Whitfield finally looked at her daughter. And what Clara saw in her mother's eyes was not cruelty. It was not hatred. It was something almost worse than either of those things. It was exhaustion, the flat, worn-out look of a woman who had been surviving for so long she had forgotten what it felt like to do anything else. "It's a good arrangement," Ruth said. "Gerald's a decent man. You'll have a roof. I have a roof. You have a corner of my roof." "That ain't the same thing." Ruth picked up her coat from where she'd set it on the counter. "I got 4 mouths to feed, Clara. You know that. You've always known that." "I've been feeding them," Clara said. "I've been feeding them for years. And now Gerald will feed you. That's how it works." Ruth moved toward the door. She paused with her hand on the frame, and for a moment, just a moment, something flickered in her face. Something that might have been grief, or guilt, or the ghost of an apology she did not know how to make. "You're a good girl. You always have been." Then she walked out. And Clara stood in Gerald Holt's trading post, with the summer light falling through the dusty window, and understood that she had just been sold. She might have gone quietly. That was the thing she thought about later. In the weeks and months that followed, she might have simply done what she had always done. Accepted it. Made herself useful. Kept her head down and her hands busy and her feelings somewhere deep and unreachable, because that was how you survived. She might have, if Gerald Holt had been a decent man. He was not a decent man. He became clear within the first hour. He showed her the room where she would sleep, a narrow space off the kitchen, barely large enough for a cot, with a window so small it admitted almost no light. He listed her duties in the flat, businesslike tone of a man accustomed to giving orders and not accustomed to hearing questions. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending. He expected breakfast before 6 and supper on the table by 7, and the house kept to a standard he described as respectable, though looking around at the state of the rooms, Clara could see that his notion of respectable and hers were considerably different. Then he said, "And you'll be here when I need company." Clara looked at him. "What kind of company?" she said. It was not a question. Gerald's eyes moved over her the way they had at the counter, and he smiled in a way that did not involve his eyes at all. "The kind a man needs," he said, "when he's been living alone 2.5 months. Clara set down the bundle of her belongings she had been holding. She set it down very carefully, because her hands were shaking again, but not with fear this time. "No," she said. Gerald blinked. He seemed genuinely surprised, as though the word was one he did not hear often in his own house. "Excuse me?" "No," she said it again, quieter and more certain. "I will cook. I will clean. I will mend every piece of cloth in this building, if that is what was agreed." But I will not, she stopped. Took a breath. Gerald's expression shifted. The false pleasantness fell away, and what was underneath it was not rage but something colder and more deliberate. Your mother and I have an arrangement. My mother did not speak for my body, Clara said. She had no right to, and you know it. You're in my house. I am in your trading post, she said. I have not agreed to anything. I have not signed anything, and I will not. The silence stretched. Then Gerald moved toward the door. I think, he said, in a voice carefully controlled, that we should discuss this where folks can hear. Since you want to play it that way. He opened the front door of the trading post. And he called out into the street. This woman, he said, loud enough to draw the attention of every person within 50 feet, came to my establishment this morning and accepted work from me. And now she's refusing to honor the agreement her own mother made on her behalf. People stopped. People turned. The way they always did in small towns, when someone raised their voice, the Clayeth had seen them turn 100 times before, drawn to drama the way summer flies are drawn to sweetness. And in the space of 30 seconds, she had an audience. Gerald continued, warming to it now, his voice taking on the aggrieved tone of a man who had been wronged. She tells me she's not bound by her mother's word. Tells me she won't honor a legitimate business arrangement. He shook his head. Now I ask you, what kind of woman does that? The crowd muttered. Clara stood in the doorway of the trading post and felt the weight of every eye in Harlan Creek settle on her like stones. She knew this crowd. She had lived in this town for 6 years. She had mended half their clothing and cooked meals for their sick children and sat with their dying relatives because no one else would. She had been quiet and useful and grateful and small, and she had truly believed that meant something. She had believed that when it mattered, they would see her. They did not see her. They saw Gerald Holt, who owned property and had money, and had been a fixture in Harlan Creek for 20 years. And they saw Clara Whitfield, who was poor and thin and motherless this morning in a way she had not been yesterday. You took his hospitality, a woman in the crowd called out. She probably planned this all along, said another voice. Knew she'd get the food and the lodging and back out of the work. Shameless, someone muttered. Clara opened her mouth. She did not know what she intended to say. She did not know if anything she could say would matter. She had been in this town for 6 years, and in 30 seconds a man with money had undone all of it with 6 sentences and a loud voice. But before she could speak, before any of the words forming in her chest could find their way out, a voice came from the back of the crowd. Quiet, but somehow in that moment, quieter than to shout. What exactly was the arrangement? The crowd shifted. People turned toward the sound of the voice, and Clara turned too. She had not noticed him ride in. She noticed him now. He sat his horse at the edge of the crowd, a big bay animal, steady and patient, and the man in the saddle was the kind of person who did not need to raise his voice to be heard. The kind of person rooms rearrange themselves around without quite understanding why. He was tall. She could tell that even mounted. Dark hair, a little long under the brim of a hat that had seen a great deal of weather. A face that the sun had worked on for years, with lines around the eyes that came from squinting into distances most people never looked at. He was not young somewhere in his middle 30s, she guessed, and he had the kind of stillness about him that comes only from spending a long time alone, with nothing but open land and your own thoughts. He was looking at Gerald Holt, not unkindly, but without any particular deference. What exactly was the arrangement? He said again. Between you and the lady's mother. Gerald straightened. That's a private business matter. Funny thing about private business matters, the man said. They usually stay private. You brought this into the street. He looked at the crowd briefly, then back at Gerald. So, what was agreed? Gerald hesitated. In the pause, something subtle shifted in the crate, the slight recalibration that happens when the person who had been dominating the room suddenly has to answer a question he doesn't want to answer. The woman's mother arranged for her to keep my house, Gerald said. In exchange for certain provisions. Provisions, the man repeated. Not mocking, just precise. Flour, salt, credit settled on an account. The quiet that followed was different from the other quiets of that morning. The man on the bay horse looked at Clara, not at Gerald. At Clara, and he asked the question that no one, not her mother, not Gerald, not a single person in that crowd had thought to ask. Was that your agreement, he said, or your mother's? Clara's throat tightened. She had not expected kindness this morning. She had not prepared herself for someone to ask what she wanted. My mother's, she said. I wasn't consulted. The man nodded once like that was exactly the answer he expected. He looked back at Gerald. A grown woman can't be bartered without her own consent, he said. That's not a business arrangement. That's something else. He paused. I think you know what else. Gerald's face went red. Now listen here. I'm listening, the man said. He had not raised his voice once. Are you going to do the same? The silence in the street had changed quality entirely. Clara could feel it. Gerald could feel it. The crowd, which had been so certain a moment ago, so righteously confident in the judgment they'd already rendered, had gone very still. Because there was something in this man's voice that was not a threat. It was something quieter, and therefore more difficult to argue with. Conviction. Gerald looked at the crowd. He seemed to be calculating, the way he always calculated odds, outcomes, what the mathematics of this particular situation would yield. He apparently did not like what the numbers told him. The arrangement's off, he said finally. Clipped. Unhappy. Take your things and go. Clara looked at him. She had not brought much. She had walked into his trading post with a leather bag containing 3 dresses, a sewing kit, a small Bible that had belonged to her grandmother, and 17 cents she had been saving for 3 months. She picked up her bag from where she had set it on the step. She walked away from Gerald Holt's trading post, and she had absolutely no idea where she was going. She made it to the end of the block before her legs stopped cooperating. It was not grief exactly, it was not fear. It was the particular exhaustion that comes when you have been holding yourself together by main force for an extended period of time, and the immediate danger has passed, and your body suddenly realizes it is allowed to stop. She sat down on the bench outside the dry goods store. She set her bag on the ground. She pressed her hands together in her lap to stop them from shaking, and looked out at the summer street of Harlan Creek, Montana, and tried to determine what in the world she was going to do next. She had 17 cents. She had no home. Her mother's house was not a home. She understood that now with a clarity that was almost relieving in its finality. She had no prospects she could name. She heard boots on the boardwalk and looked up. The man from the crowd was standing at a polite distance. He had left his horse hitched to the post up the street. He held his hat in his hands, which she thought was strange. Not many men in a frontier town stood before a woman with their hat in their hands, and he was looking at her with the direct, steady gaze of someone who is used to assessing difficult situations without flinching. I don't need rescuing, she said immediately. It came out sharper than she intended. He did not seem offended. I know, he said. You made that pretty clear back there. A pause. I'm Ethan Callahan, he said. I run a spread about 6 miles east of town. The old Callahan Ranch. You may have heard of it. She had, vaguely. A large operation, well run by all accounts. A man who kept to himself. Clara Whitfield, she said. He nodded. Miss Whitfield. He turned his hat over once in his hands, a gesture that struck her as uncharacteristically uncertain for a man who had just walked into a crowd and stilled it with one quiet question. I'm not here to offer you charity. Good, she said. Because I won't take it. I didn't think you would. He was quiet for a moment. I'm here because I have a ranch that needs managing, and I've been running it short-handed for 2 years. I need someone who can cook and keep accounts and has enough spine to say no when something ain't right. He looked at her. Based on the last 10 minutes, You appear to qualify on all counts." Clara studied him. She had become a student of men's faces over the years, their tells, their hidden calculations, the small signals that indicated whether a kindness was genuine or whether it came attached to an expectation she'd be required to pay down eventually. She looked for those signals in Ethan Callahan's face. She did not find them. What she found instead was something she had not expected, a man who looked tired. Not physically tired, though she suspected he worked himself hard, but the deeper tiredness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had gotten so accustomed to the weight that they had stopped noticing it was there. "What are the terms?" she said. "Fair wage. Paid weekly." He named a figure that was more than she'd earned in any week of her life. "Your own room. Your own time on Sundays. You eat with the household, that's me. And in summer sometimes the hands eat up at the house too, but they know how to behave themselves." He paused. "You leave whenever you want. The door ain't locked. And what do you expect in return? Cooking. Accounts. Whatever else needs doing that you're willing to do." He held her gaze. "Nothing you're not willing to do. That ain't something I'd ever ask." She believed him. She was not entirely sure why. She had known men who could lie with their eyes wide and sincere. But there was something in the plainness of the way he said it, nothing decorated, nothing performed, that felt different from calculation. "I'd need to see the books first," she said. "Before I agree to keep accounts, I'd need to see what I'm working with." Something shifted in his face, not surprise exactly. More like recognition. The look of someone who has asked a question and received an answer that matched what they secretly hoped for. "Fair enough," he said. "You can look them over today if you want." No obligation either way. Clara picked up her bag. She stood. She realized, aware of the irony of the morning she had started the day being traded by her mother, and she was ending it by negotiating her own terms with a stranger. She was not sure what it said about the day. She was not sure it said anything, except that this was how life worked when you were Clara Whitfield. You adapted. You survived. You kept your hands from shaking even when everything in you wanted to fall apart. "All right, Mr. Callahan," she said. "I'll look at the books." The ride out to the Callahan ranch took just under an hour in the summer heat, and they spent most of it in a silence that Clara found, to her mild surprise, not uncomfortable. He rode his bay horse at a pace considerate enough that she didn't have to struggle to keep up on the borrowed mule he'd arranged for her. From the livery she noticed, he'd handled that quietly, no fuss. Just a brief exchange with the livery owner and the mule appeared, and she had not been asked to smile or express gratitude beyond what was practical. She appreciated that. She was not in a grateful mood. She spent the ride looking at the country around her, the wide summer grasses, the mountains still carrying snow on their shoulders even in July. The way the light fell across it all, in a way that would have been beautiful if she had been in any state to appreciate beauty. She was mostly just trying to figure out how much danger she was in. "How long have you been in Harlan Creek?" Ethan asked. 6 years. She's on your own? With my mother. But on my own, mostly. She paused. She has other children. Younger ones. I've been helping to support them since my father left. He was quiet for a moment. That's a long time to carry that. It's just what was needed, she said. The old automatic answer. The one she had given so many times it had worn smooth as a river stone. Someone had, he said. Doesn't mean it had to be you. She looked at him sharply. He was looking ahead, at the trail, and his expression was even and unreadable, and she could not tell if he meant anything particular by it, or if he was simply speaking the words that occurred to him. She had never in 24 years heard anyone say that. Doesn't mean it had to be you. She turned back to the trail and did not say anything, because she did not trust what might come out of her mouth if she did. The ranch was not what she expected. She had imagined something like what she knew of wealthy men's houses, imposing, a little performative, built to impress. What she found was a large, functional house of weathered wood, surrounded by outbuildings and fenced pastures, and the sounds of horses and the smell of summer hay, and it was completely plain and completely unpretentious and somehow, because of that, more solid feeling than anything she had ever lived in. He showed her the main house, the kitchen, the sitting room, the small office where the accounts were kept, and then a room at the end of the hallway. It was not large, but it had a window that looked east, toward the mountains. And it had a lock on the door on the inside. She noticed the lock. He noticed her noticing it. "I had that put on last year," he said. "Previous housekeeper asked for it. Figured it should stay." Clara said nothing. She set her bag on the bed. Then she turned to him. "You said I could see the books." He brought her the account books. She sat at the desk in the small office and opened them and spent the next hour going through them while he went out to see to whatever a ranch owner sees to on a Tuesday afternoon. And she had not expected to find anything except a mess she would have to untangle. But what she found instead was a moderate mess with underlying good sense, the kind of financial picture that resulted not from incompetence, but from one person trying to keep too many things organized at once. She could fix this. She knew she could fix it. She sat back in the chair and looked out the window of the office at the summer afternoon, at the horses moving in the far pasture, at the mountains beyond, at the sky which was the blue of deep summer. The kind of blue you only get in the West when the light is right, and she was aware of something she had not felt in years. The feeling of being somewhere she might be able to breathe. When Ethan came back to the office doorway, she was still looking at the books. "Well," he said, "your accounts payable are 3 months behind, and your ledger hasn't been reconciled since February," she said. "And you've been overpaying the feed supplier by about 15% because you haven't been tracking delivery weights against invoices." He was quiet for a moment. "It's fixable," she said. "But yes, it's not good." He nodded a pause. "Does that mean you'll take the job?" Clara looked down at the open ledger. She looked at the columns of numbers, imperfect and improvable. She thought about Gerald Holt's room off the kitchen and the thing he had implied about company. She thought about her mother's face when she had looked at her, that exhausted, finished look. She thought about Ethan Callahan standing in a crowd with his hat in his hands and asking a question no one else had thought to ask. "Was that your agreement? Or your mother's?" She closed the ledger. "I'll need Sundays," she said. "Agreed. And I'll renegotiate the wage in 3 months, once I've seen what the workload actually is." "Reasonable. And if something happens that I'm not comfortable with, I'll say so. And I expect to be heard." "You'll be heard," he said simply. Clara stood. She held out her hand. He shook it, a firm, straightforward handshake. No performance, no lingering, and then stepped back. "Room at the end of the hall," he said. "Supper's usually around 7. I can cook tolerably if you'd rather rest tonight." "I'll cook," she said. It was reflex, the deep-rooted instinct that told her usefulness was safety. But then she stopped herself. She thought about what he had said on the trail. "Doesn't mean it had to be you. Actually," she said. "What can you cook tolerably?" He seemed faintly surprised by the question. "Beans," he said. "Salt, pork, cornbread if the oven's behaving." "That'll do for tonight," Clara said. "I'll start the real cooking tomorrow." She picked up her bag and walked to the room at the end of the hall. She unlocked the door. She went inside. And for the first time in 24 years, she locked the door from the inside, the key solid and certain in her hand. The room quiet, the summer light coming in through the east-facing window, and stood in a space that was hers. Not earned, not borrowed, not traded for, just hers, because someone had offered it and she had chosen to take it. Outside she could hear the sounds of the ranch horses, wind, the distant voices of the hands finishing the day's work. She could hear Ethan Callahan moving in the kitchen, the sound of a cast-iron pot being set on the stove, the small orderly sounds of a person trying to be useful. She sat on the edge of the bed. She pressed her hands together in her lap. Her mother had tried to trade her for a sack of flour this morning. And here she was. She did not know yet what this place would become. She did not know what Ethan Callahan would turn out to be beyond a man who had stood in a crowd with his hat in his hands and asked the one question she'd needed someone to ask. She did not know if she was safe. She did not know if she was making the right choice. She only knew that for the first time in years, the choice had been hers to make. And that, Clara Whitfield thought, as the summer evening came softly through the window, that was not nothing. That was in fact everything. The first morning at the Callahan Ranch, Clara woke before 5. Old habit. The kind that lives in the bones, not the mind, the kind that no amount of exhaustion or upheaval can touch, because it was trained into her so young and so thoroughly that sleeping past dawn felt like a moral failing. She lay still for a moment in the unfamiliar dark and listened. The ranch made sounds she was not used to, the creak of the house settling in the pre-dawn cool. Horses moving in the far pasture, a sound like patience itself. Wind coming off the mountains, dry and clean in the way that only summer mountain air can be, carrying with it the smell of grass and distance. She pressed her hand flat against the wall beside the bed. Solid. Real. She had half expected to wake up back in her mother's house, or in Gerald Holt's narrow room off the kitchen. She had half expected the previous day to dissolve into the particular logic of a bad dream, the kind where everything is vivid and terrible, and then you open your eyes and it releases you. But the wall was solid, and the room was hers. She got up. She dressed in the dark by feel, the way she always had. She braided her hair back without a mirror. She folded the blanket on the bed with the automatic precision of someone who had been making do in small spaces for years and had learned that neatness was a form of control when everything else was uncertain. Then she unlocked the door and walked to the kitchen. Ethan was already there. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee and the ranch ledger open in front of him. And he looked up when she came in with the unsurprised expression of a man who had expected she would be an early riser and had simply been waiting to see when. "Coffee's on," he said. "Thank you." She moved to the stove. Found the cups without being told where they were, because in any kitchen she had ever been in, the cups were always within arm's reach of the stove. Found the sugar. Poured. Then turned and looked at the ledger on the table. "You're looking at the February reconciliation." "Trying to," he said. "Can't make heads or tails of it. That's because whoever recorded it was tracking cash receipts and credits separately and then mixing them in the same column." She set down her cup. "May I?" He slid the book toward her without hesitation. She sat down across from him and turned the ledger to face her and spent the next 10 minutes going through it while he drank his coffee and did not speak, which she appreciated more than she could say. Most men, in her experience, could not resist explaining things to her. Ethan Callahan appeared to understand that she did not need things explained. "Here," she said finally. She turned the book around and pointed. "This column is your problem. Someone's been netting the figures before recording them, which means you can't trace individual transactions. Going forward, everything gets recorded gross. Receipts in, payments out, nothing netted until the monthly summary." He looked at where she was pointing. "Is that complicated to fix?" "Going forward, no." Going, she exhaled. "It'll take me about 2 weeks to reconstruct the first quarter properly." He was quiet for a moment. "You learned accounting?" "I taught myself." She turned the ledger back to face her. "When I was keeping books for the seamstress shop mine, before the merchant drove it under, I couldn't afford to hire anyone to explain it to me. So I got books from the lending library and figured it out." Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then, "What merchant?" Clara looked up. She had not intended to say that. It had come out the way things sometimes did when she was focused on something else, and her guard slipped casually, without calculation, as though it were just a fact about the world. "A man in Harlan Creek named Aldous Pemberton," she said. "He had the contract for supplying dry goods to 3 ranches north of town. 2 years ago, I started doing his books, because his wife was ill and he needed the help. When she died, he decided he didn't want to pay me anymore." She paused. He told people I'd made errors in the accounts and that he'd had to let me go for incompetence. It killed my reputation in town. No one would hire me after that. Ethan was watching her face. The errors were his, he said. Not a question. Yes, she said, they were his. Another silence. Different from the first one. Pemberton, he repeated. Big man? Runs the dry goods on Fletcher Street? The same. Ethan nodded once, said nothing more. But something in the set of his jaw told Clara that the name had landed somewhere it intended to stay, and she filed that away without comment. She turned back to the ledger. I'll start the reconstruction after breakfast, she said. You don't have to start today, he said. You just got here. I know, she did not look up. I want to, she felt him looking at her. She felt the particular quality of that look, not invasive, not assessing the way Gerald Holt's eyes had been assessing. Something more like careful. The way you look at something fragile that you're not sure you understand yet and don't want to damage by mishandling. All right, he said. He closed his coffee cup in both hands and stood. I'll be in the north pasture most of the morning. Hands eat at noon. There's 4 of them this summer. They know to come to the back door. They're decent men. If any one of them gives you trouble, you tell me. Clara looked up at that. I can manage ranch hands. I know you can, he said. I'm telling you anyway. He put on his hat. Moved toward the door. Then stopped with one hand on the frame, the way her mother had stopped the previous morning, but differently. Everything about it differently. Miss Whitfield. Clara, she said, if we're going to be living in the same house, Miss Whitfield is going to get tiresome. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, but in the territory of one. Clara, he said, there are eggs in the cold box and flour in the bin. The hens are out back. I'll leave the rest to your judgment. Then he walked out, and the kitchen held the shape of his absence for a moment, and Clara sat at the table with the ledger open in front of her and the summer morning coming through the window, and she thought, for the first time in as long as she could remember, that she did not feel afraid of what the day was going to bring. That was new enough that she sat with it for a moment before she went to find the eggs. The 4 ranch hands were named Dewey Cal, a young man everyone called Rooster because of an incident with a weather vane that no one explained fully, and an older Mexican hand named Ignacio, who had been with the ranch for 11 years and had, Clara quickly determined, approximately 4 times as much practical authority as his official position suggested. Ignacio was the one who told her, on that first morning, where the good flour was kept, not the bag Ethan had said was in the bin, which was getting old, but a newer sack he'd put in the dry storage without mentioning it. He was also the one who told her, without being asked, that Mr. Callahan had not eaten a proper meal since the previous cook left in May, and that he'd been surviving on beans and hardtack and coffee, and that if she could manage a decent biscuit, he would personally consider her a gift from the Almighty. Clara could manage considerably more than a decent biscuit. By the time noon came, she had produced a meal substantial enough to silence 4 hungry men for 20 solid minutes, which was, in her experience, the highest possible compliment a working ranch hand could pay. Lord in heaven, Dewey said, which covered the general sentiment. Rooster ate 3 portions and looked slightly stunned. Ignacio looked at Clara across the table with an expression of quiet satisfaction, as though something he had suspected had been confirmed. Only Cal, who was 20 years old and earnest, in the way only very young men who haven't yet been badly disappointed by anything can be, looked up from his plate and said with complete sincerity, "You cook like my grandmother." Ma'am, and she was the finest cook in Bozeman County. Thank you, Clara said. She was standing at the stove, eating her own meal, standing up out of habit. It had been years since she'd sat at a table she wasn't serving, and she caught herself and forced herself to sit down. Old habits, the kind that took conscious effort to break. Ethan came in from the pasture just as the hands were finishing, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the table, and then at Clara with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "I told you I could cook tolerably for tonight," he said. "You did," she agreed. "I decided not to wait." He hung his hat on the peg by the door, sat down, ate in silence, which was not rudeness. She understood that already, after less than a day, that Ethan Callahan's silences were not vacant. They were full of things he was thinking through. When he was finished, he said, "That's the best meal this kitchen has produced in 2 years." "You're kind," Clara said. "I'm honest," he said. "There's a difference." The weeks moved in a rhythm she had not expected. She had expected work, and the work was real: the ledgers, the meals, the management of the household, and the coordinations with the hands, and the 100 small, practical demands of a working ranch in summer. She had expected to earn her place, the way she had always earned every place she had ever occupied. What she had not expected was how quickly the ranch began to feel like somewhere she belonged. It happened in pieces, small things, the way Ethan moved around her in the kitchen without getting in her way, as though they had worked in the same space for years. The way Ignacio began including her in the quiet early morning conversations about the day's work, as though her opinion on whether the south fence needed mending before or after the hay cutting actually mattered to the operation. The way Rooster, who was young and a little ridiculous and completely harmless, had started leaving small bundles of wildflowers on the kitchen windowsill, because he'd mentioned once that she'd said the house could use some color. She caught herself noticing things she had not noticed in years. The particular quality of the light in the morning. The sound the horses made when they recognized a familiar step. The way the summer grass moved in the afternoon wind, wave after wave of it, like something breathing. One morning, about 3 weeks in, she was in the barn checking on a mare who had been favoring her left foreleg, and Ethan came in and found her crouched beside the horse, with her hands moving carefully along the animal's leg, feeling for heat. He stood in the barn doorway for a moment, without speaking. "She's got a stone bruise," Clara said without looking up. "Not serious, but she shouldn't be worked for at least a week." "How do you know that?" "I kept books for a farrier for 3 months when I was 19. She stood, brushed her hands on her apron, "and I asked Ignacio last week what to look for." Ethan looked at the mare, looked at Clara. "You've been checking on her every morning," he said. She was uncomfortable. Clara moved to the water bucket and rinsed her hands. "Something hurt. Someone should pay attention to it." She said it simply, without significance, and it was only later, much later, lying awake in her room, with the summer stars visible through the window, that she understood why he had looked at her the way he had in that moment. Because she had just described in 8 words exactly how she herself had spent 24 years hoping someone would think about her. Something hurt. Someone should pay attention. She had never once had that someone. She was only learning, slowly and with considerable resistance from her own deeply established habits, that having it might be possible. It was Rooster who brought her the first warning. He came to the kitchen door on a Thursday afternoon, hat in hand, looking younger than his 19 years and deeply uncomfortable. "There's something you should know, Miss Clara," he said. She dried her hands on her apron. "Tell me." He twisted his hat brim. "In town. Last Saturday when I went in for supplies. People are talking. About you," he said. "About you being here. Some folks are saying." He stopped. Tried again. "They're saying you came out here to get your hands on Mr. Callahan's land. That you planned the whole thing. The business at Gerald Holt's trading post. Some folks are saying that was arranged. That you knew Mr. Callahan would be there." Clara was very still. "Who's saying it?" she said. Rooster looked even more uncomfortable. "Mrs. Sister." And he hesitated. "And Gerald Holt, ma'am. He's been talking quite a bit." Of course he had. A man like Gerald Holt did not simply absorb a public refusal and move on. A man like Gerald Holt nursed it, let it curdle into something uglier, and then waited for an opportunity to put that ugliness to use. "Thank you for telling me," Clara said. She kept her voice level. "You didn't have to." "No, ma'am," he put his hat back on. "But I figured you'd want to know. She figured she should leave. She had thought this before she had learned the pattern well enough in her life to recognize it quickly. This was the moment where you were ahead of the trouble, when you could still get out clean before it arrived. Before it settled over you, like weather, and became the thing that defined you in a place. She had left places before. She was good at it. She was, in fact, so practiced at it that the voice telling her to pack her bag and go was louder and more familiar than almost any other voice she had. She went to find Ethan. He was at the fence on the north side of the property, restringing wire with Ignacio, and he heard her coming across the field. She had learned. He always heard her coming. That he had the particular animal alertness of someone who had lived alone a long time and could not entirely turn it off, and he looked up before she was close enough for most people to have noticed her. She told him what Rooster had said. She told it plainly, without drama, because that was how she handled difficult information stripped of everything except what was necessary, because in her experience, the addition of emotion to difficult information usually only made it harder to act on. When she finished, Ethan said nothing for a moment. Then he set down the wire stretcher and said, "Are you thinking about leaving?" "I'm thinking it might be better for you if I did," she said. Rumors like this don't stay quiet in a town like Harlan Creek. They grow, and they'll grow in your direction. I know that. "Your reputation, my reputation," he said, "is my concern." He looked at her steadily. "I'm asking about you. Are you leaving because you want to leave, or because you think it protects someone?" Clara opened her mouth, closed it, because the honest answer was the second one, and she knew it. And she had the uncomfortable feeling that he knew it too. "Leaving doesn't protect anyone," he said. "It just lets them win." He picked up the wire stretcher again. "You've done nothing wrong. I haven't done anything wrong. Gerald Holt is an angry man with a grudge, and there are always people in small towns who'd rather have a story than the truth." He looked at her over his shoulder. "But I don't run my ranch based on Gerald Holt's comfort. And I'd ask you not to make decisions based on it either." Clara stood in the summer field, with the wind moving through the grass around her. "You're very certain," she said. "I'm very tired of running from things," he said. It came out flat, with a weight under it that told her it was not a general statement but a specific one. Something personal. Something he had not intended to share and had shared anyway. She filed it away. "Did not push," she said. She turned back toward the house. "Clara." She stopped. "I meant what I said about telling me if something makes you uncomfortable." His voice was even, but direct. "That includes things that happen in town. That includes Gerald Holt. That includes—" he paused. "Anything." She looked at him across the summer field. "I'll tell you," she said. She was not entirely sure she would. "Old habits." But she meant it when she said it, which was a start. The first real test came on a Saturday, 12 days after Rooster's warning. Clara had gone into town for supplies. Ethan had offered to send one of the hands, but she had refused. Partly out of stubbornness, and partly because she had decided that the moment she stopped showing her face in Harlan Creek was the moment she admitted the rumors had power over her. She was in the dry goods store on Fletcher Street, making her way through the supply list with the careful attention of someone managing a budget that had more competing demands than available funds, when she became aware that the conversation in the store had stopped. She had been in enough rooms when conversations stopped because of her to know immediately what it meant. She continued reading the supply list. The woman who had stopped talking was named Frances Aldrich, and she was 62 years old and had been the primary social authority in Harlan Creek for at least 20 of those years. And she looked at Clara with the specific expression of a woman who has made a decision and is prepared to announce it. "I'm surprised you show yourself in town," Frances said. Clara looked up from the list. "Afternoon, Mrs. Aldrich." "Don't you afternoon me, girl." Frances took a step forward, the kind of step designed to use the advantage of solid footing. "We know what you're doing out at the Callahan Ranch. Ethan Callahan is a decent man who's lived alone too long, and a clever girl can take advantage of that. Can she? Clara said. Don't be smart with me. I'm not being smart, Clara said. I'm asking a genuine question. What exactly do you think is happening? I think a woman with nothing to her name saw an opportunity, and she took it. And I think Ethan Callahan is too good a man and too isolated to see it clearly. The store had gone very quiet. There were 4 other people in it. Clara was aware of all of them. Mrs. Aldrich, she said carefully. I keep Miss Callahan's books. I cook. I manage the household. I am paid a fair wage for that work which I am earning. She kept her voice level. If you have specific evidence of wrongdoing, I'd encourage you to bring it to someone with authority. If you don't, your mother sold you, Frances said, and the words landed in the silence like stones in water. A woman her own mother sold ain't the kind of woman a decent man ought to be keeping in his house. Clara felt the words hit. She had felt words hit before. She was experienced at it, experienced at the way a precise cruelty can find the exact place where you are softest and press. She was experienced at keeping her face still, and her hands from shaking, and her voice from cracking. She did not always succeed, but she was experienced at the attempt. What my mother did, Clara said, is between her and God. What I do is what I choose. She held Frances Aldrich's gaze. And what I choose is to earn my living honestly and conduct myself with integrity. If that's not sufficient for your approval, I'll have to manage without it. She turned back to the counter. Her hands were not entirely steady when she handed the list to the store clerk. But she did not walk out. She finished her order. She paid for it. She loaded the supplies into the wagon, and she drove back to the ranch with her back straight and her chin level and everything in her shaking on the inside where no one could see it. She was halfway back to the ranch when she heard hoofbeats behind her and pulled the wagon to the side of the trail, and Ethan brought his bay horse alongside. He looked at her. She looked at the trail ahead. Rooster saw you coming out of the dry goods store, he said. Said you looked like you'd had a difficult time. Rooster worries 19. And not wrong about most things. A pause. Frances Aldrich? Clara was quiet for a moment. Then, how did you know? Because she's done it before, he said. To other people. And because she was in the store when you were. He rode alongside her in silence for a beat. What did she say? Nothing that wasn't said before Gerald Holt's trading post. That's not what I asked. Clara glanced at him. He was looking at the trail, riding easily, his hat brimmed down against the afternoon sun, and he looked like a man who was going to wait exactly as long as it took, and not 1 second longer. She told him. She told him what Frances Aldrich had said about her mother, about the selling, about the kind of woman she was or wasn't. She told it in the same flat, factual tone she'd used to tell him about Gerald Holt's rumors. When she finished, Ethan was quiet long enough that she wondered if he was going to say anything at all. Then he said, She's wrong. You don't have to. I'm not saying it to make you feel better, he said. I'm saying it because it's true. What your mother did has nothing to do with the kind of woman you are. Any person with eyes can see that. Inside of 5 minutes, he paused. Frances Aldrich has eyes. She's choosing not to use them. Clara said nothing. The wagon moved along the trail. The summer afternoon was going amber around the edges, the light turning the color it got in the late afternoon in Montana deep and golden and almost unbearably beautiful, the kind of light that made everything it touched look permanent. Ethan, she said. It was the first time she had used his name. She had been saying Mr. Callahan, the way it was proper, even though he had not asked her to. He glanced at her. Why do you live alone? She asked. You don't have to answer, I'm just... She stopped. You're a good man. Decent. In the actual sense of it, not the way people use it to mean inoffensive. You're capable and you're fair and you're not cruel. She looked at the trail. Men like that don't usually end up alone unless they've chosen it. The silence lasted long enough that she thought she had gone too far. Then he said, My wife's name was Margaret. She left 7 years ago. Clara went very still. We married young, he said. She was from back east. She wanted a different kind of life than this one. And I paused, long enough that the pause had weight. I loved this land more than I understood how to love a person. And she knew it before I did. He looked at the mountains on the horizon. She wrote me a letter when she left. She said she didn't want to be second to anything that couldn't love her back. The silence after that was the kind that didn't need filling. I've thought about that letter a lot, he said. 7 years is a lot of thinking. Have you reached any conclusions? Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment. Some, he said. I'm still working on them. They rode back to the ranch in the amber afternoon, and Clara thought about a woman named Margaret and a letter, and a man who had spent 7 years figuring out what it meant to love something correctly. And she thought about her own 24 years of making herself useful and small and necessary, and never not once stopping to ask what she wanted. They were both, she thought, in the process of becoming something they hadn't been before. She wasn't sure either of them knew what that something was yet. But for the first time, she didn't find the uncertainty frightening. She found it carefully, with considerable reservation, and in the private space of her own chest, where she kept things that were not ready to be spoken, she found it something like hope. 2 days later, on a Monday morning when the sky was the pale clear blue of early summer, and the heat hadn't yet built to its afternoon pitch, Clara came into the office to work on the accounts and found a paper on the desk that she had not put there. It was a legal notice, stamped with the seal of the territorial court in Helena. She read it twice. Then she set it down very carefully, the way you set down something that has more weight than it looks like, and she went to find Ethan. He was in the barn. He looked up when she came in, read her face, and said, "What's happened?" She handed him the notice. He read it. His face, which was normally difficult to read, went through several things in the space of 10 seconds, a quick tightening, then something careful and controlled, then something else underneath that, harder to name. That looked a great deal like the face of a man who had been expecting something bad for long enough that the arrival of it was almost a relief. "They're claiming the water rights," he said. "To the creek on your north boundary," Clara said. "Yes, that creek has been Callahan land since 1869. My father established that water right before I was born." He lowered the paper. "This is Holt's doing. The names on the notice are Reyes and Marsh," Clara said. "Reyes and Marsh are business partners of Gerald Holt," Ethan said. "Have been for years. Everyone in the county knows it." He set the paper on a hay bale. "They want the north pasture. The creek is an excuse. If they can dispute the water right, they can make working that land impossible, and eventually I'll be forced to sell." Clara was quiet. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "Where are your father's original land documents?" she said. He was still for a moment. "In the office, in the lockbox under the floorboard." "Why?" "Because," Clara said carefully, "in the 3 weeks I've been going through your accounts, I found references to transactions involving that water right. Property transfer records, survey documents. If the original filings are in that lockbox, and if they are what I think they are," she stopped. "I need to look at them before I tell you what I'm thinking." He looked at her for a long moment. "Come with me," he said. They went to the office. He moved the rug, lifted the floorboard, retrieved a lockbox that was heavier than it looked, worn smooth by years of handling, secured with a lock so old it had gone dark with oxidation. He opened it, and Clara Whitfield, who had taught herself accounting from library books and spent 3 weeks methodically working through the disordered records of a ranch she had arrived at with 17 cents and a worn leather bag, sat down at the desk and began to read. What she found there in the yellowed documents and careful handwriting of a man who had built something from open land and stubborn will was not just a defense. It was a weapon. She looked up at Ethan. "They're wrong," she said. "Not just legally. They've made a specific factual error in the claim." A survey error. They've cited a boundary line that was superseded by a corrected survey in 1871, and your father filed the corrected water right against the new boundary. She set her hand flat on the document. If you take this to the territorial court, they don't just lose their claim. They lose it on the basis of a falsified submission. Ethan stared at her. Gerald Holt, he said slowly, is going to have to answer for that. Yes, Clara said, he is. The summer morning was very quiet around them. The ranch sounds continued outside, horses, wind, the distant voices of the hands, and inside the office there were just two people sitting across from each other with a box full of documents between them, and something in the air had shifted. Something that felt, Clara thought, a great deal like a turning point. She had come to this ranch with 17 cents and no prospects and no plan beyond not going back to Gerald Holt's back room. She had not planned to become necessary. She had not planned to find something worth defending. But she was looking at the documents in front of her, and at the man across the desk from her. And she thought with the same quiet certainty she had felt when she read the accounts that first morning that this was not a story where she was going to let the wrong people win. She had been quiet for 24 years. She did not intend to be quiet now. The territorial court in Helena was 6 days' ride from Harlan Creek, and they had 3 weeks before the hearing date printed on the legal notice. 3 weeks was not much time. Clara understood this with the same clarity she brought to everything that needed to be understood quickly, completely, without the luxury of panic. She spread the documents across the office desk the morning after they found them and began making a list of what they had, what they needed, and what the gaps between those two things were going to cost them. Ethan stood in the doorway watching her work. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said. She did not look up from the documents. "Hand me that ledger. The 1871 one." He handed her the ledger. "Clara." She looked up. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and he had the expression he got when he was about to say something he had been turning over for a while, measured, careful, like a man choosing his footing on uncertain ground. "This is my fight," he said. "You've got no obligation to." "You're right," she said. "I don't." She held his gaze. "But I found the error in the filing. I know these documents better than anyone except your father, and he's been dead 11 years. So the practical reality is that you need me." She paused. "Unless you'd rather make your case in Helena without someone who can explain the 1871 survey correction to a territorial judge." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd rather not," he said. "Then stop telling me I don't have to do this, and let me do it." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood. "Yes, ma'am," he said. She turned back to the documents. But she could feel him still standing in the doorway for a moment longer before he left, and she was aware in the place where she kept things that weren't ready to be spoken yet that she was not only doing this because it was practical. She was doing it because for the first time in her life, something was worth fighting for. She had not known what that felt like before. She was finding out. The first thing she needed was a copy of the 1871 survey filing. The original was in the lockbox, fragile at the folds, and she was not going to risk the only copy in a 6-day ride across open country. She needed it duplicated, and she needed the duplication done accurately enough to stand up to legal scrutiny. There was a man in Harlan Creek named Arthur Finch who did cartography and document copying for the county recorder's office. He was meticulous, honest, and deeply uninterested in gossip, which made him the closest thing to a neutral party available. Clara went to see him the next morning. She had barely walked through his door when she understood that the news had arrived before her. Arthur Finch was a thin, mild man of 50 who wore the same expression regardless of the circumstances, a kind of settled, academic calm, but he looked up from his drafting table when she came in and said, "Immediately, I heard about the water rights claim." "Then you know why I'm here," Clara said. "I know why you're here." He set down his pen. I also know that Gerald Holt was in my office yesterday afternoon, asking whether I'd received any requests regarding Callahan land documents. Clara went very still. He told you not to help us, she said. He suggested, Arthur said, with careful precision, that helping the Callahan ranch with their legal situation might complicate certain business relationships he has with several of my regular clients. And? Arthur looked at her over the top of his spectacles. And I told him that my professional obligation is to the accuracy of documents, not to the convenience of businessmen. He picked up his pen again. What do you need copied? Clara exhaled. She set the survey documents on his table. All of it, she said. And I need it in 3 days. 2 days, he said. If you want it done right. She looked at him. 2 days, she turned to leave. Miss Whitfield, he said. She paused. Holt is afraid of what you're going to find, Arthur said. He said it simply, without drama, the way he would state a measurement. People don't issue warnings to cartographers unless they're afraid of the maps. Clara absorbed that. Then she walked out into the summer street and went back to the ranch and worked until midnight, because 2 days was not very long, and there was a great deal still to understand. The second thing she needed was a lawyer. There was one lawyer in Harlan Creek, a man named Silas Webb, who had practiced territorial law for 15 years and had the reputation of being effective, expensive, and genuinely unafraid of powerful men. He was also, as Clara discovered when she and Ethan met with him the following afternoon, already aware of the situation. Reyes and Marsh, Silas said, leaning back in his chair and pressing his fingertips together. Yes, I've seen the filing. Who helped you find the survey error? I did, Clara said. He looked at her. The look was not dismissive. She had braced for dismissive, had her response ready, but it was assessing in the particular way of a man who has learned through long practice to value competence above expectation. Walk me through it, he said. She walked him through it. She took him through the 1,869 original filing, the 1,871 corrected survey. The specific boundary line that Reyes and Marsh had cited in their claim, a line that appeared in the 1,869 document, but had been legally superseded by the correction and the implications of building a water rights. Claim on a document that had been officially replaced. When she finished, Silas Webb was quiet for long enough that Ethan, sitting beside her, shifted slightly in his chair. They didn't just make an error, Silas said finally. No, Clara said. The 1,871 correction was filed with the Territorial Office and publicly recorded. Anyone competent enough to file a water rights claim is competent enough to find a public record. Which means they knew, Silas said. Which means they chose the older document deliberately, Clara said. Because it supported the boundary they wanted. The silence in the room had the particular quality of a thing that has just become clear. Miss Whitfield, Silas said, have you considered the law as a profession? Ethan made a sound that Clara thought, under different circumstances, might have been a laugh. I've considered a great many things, she said. Right now I'm considering how to keep a man's ranch out of Gerald Holt's hands. Then let's talk about how to do that, Silas said, and he pulled a fresh sheet of paper from his drawer and started writing. The third thing she needed, she did not expect. She was leaving Silas Webb's office 3 days before they were due to set out for Helena when she came around the corner of Fletcher Street and walked directly into her mother. Ruth Whitfield had not changed in the weeks since the morning at Gerald Holt's trading post. She looked the same worn coat, the same exhausted set to her face, the same way she held herself as though bracing against weather that never stopped coming. They stopped. They looked at each other. The street moved around them. I heard you're going to Helena, Ruth said, on account of Callahan's land trouble. Yes, Clara said. I heard you're the one who found whatever it is that's going to win it for him. I don't know that we'll win, Clara said, but I found something that should help. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Her eyes moved across Clara's face with an expression Clara couldn't immediately name, And then she recognized it, with a small shock of surprise, as something she hadn't seen on her mother's face in a very long time. "Pride. You always were the smart one," Ruth said. Clara felt the words land somewhere they should not have been able to land, in a place she had thought was fully defended. "Mama," she said. "I know," Ruth said. She said it quietly, looking at the street beside Clara's shoulder rather than directly at her. "I know what I did. I've known every day since." She pressed her lips together. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't know that I'd know what to do with it if you did." "Then what are you asking?" Ruth looked at her directly then. "Nothing. I'm not asking anything." She pulled her coat tighter, though it was not cold. "I just wanted you to know that I know." Clara stood on the summer street in Harlan Creek and looked at her mother, at the lines on her face, at the years in her hands, at the specific kind of damage that comes not from cruelty but from fear and desperation, and not knowing any other way, and she felt something complicated move through her that was not forgiveness yet, and was not anger anymore, and did not have a clean name. "The younger ones," Clara said. "Are they all right?" Ruth blinked. "They're managing. Tell Jimmy his cough will be better if he sleeps on his side. And tell Elsa," she stopped. "Tell Elsa she can come see me at the ranch if she wants." "Ethan won't mind." Ruth stared at her. "Clara, I'm not forgiving anything today," Clara said. "I'm just telling you the younger ones are welcome." She adjusted the bag on her shoulder. "I have work to do." She walked away. She did not look back. But her hands were shaking again, and this time she let them, because there was no one watching, and because some things deserved to shake you. And because she had spent 24 years not allowing herself to feel the full weight of what she was carrying, and she thought she might be beginning to put some of it down. They left for Helena 4 days later, Clara, Ethan, and Silas Webb, and the morning they departed, something happened that Clara had not anticipated. Ignacio was at the barn when they were loading the horses. He had said nothing to her about the water rights dispute, had simply continued his daily work with the settled patience that was his characteristic mode. But as to checking the saddle on the horse, Ethan had lent her for the ride, a steady gray mare she had gotten comfortable with over the weeks. Ignacio appeared at her elbow. He pressed something into her hand. It was a folded document. She opened it. It was a letter, written in Spanish, and then translated in careful English on the reverse, signed by Ignacio and dated 1872, describing his own witnessing of the original survey boundary markers placed on the Callahan North pasture. He had been there. He had watched the surveyors place the markers. He had never been asked about it. Mr. Callahan's father was a good man, Ignacio said. He deserves better than what they're trying to do to his land. He looked at Clara steadily. So do you. Clara looked at the letter. She looked at Ignacio. This is exactly what we needed, she said. How long have you had this? I wrote it down 11 years ago, he said. When Mr. Callahan Sr. died. I thought someone might need it someday. He shrugged. The small economical shrug of a man who does not require acknowledgement for doing the right thing. Turns out today is that day. Clara folded the letter carefully and put it in the document case with everything else. She looked at Ignacio for a long moment. Thank you, she said. And because the word felt insufficient for what he had just done, she added, for this. And for everything else. He nodded once, put his hat back on, and went back to his work. The road to Helena opened ahead of them, long and summer dry, and Clara rode out onto it with a document case full of evidence, a lawyer, a man who had chosen to stand beside her rather than in front of her, and something she was only beginning to recognize as her own voice. The 6 days to Helena were long. They rode through a country that was trying its best to be beautiful despite the heat, and Clara learned things about Ethan Callahan on that road that she would not have learned in 100 conversations in the office or the kitchen. She learned that he woke earlier than she did, which she had not thought was possible. She learned that he could go 4 hours without speaking and not feel the need to apologize for it. She learned that he noticed things a hawk circling at a distance, a trail branching off the main road that he identified as an old elk run, the specific quality of a cloud formation that told him rain was 2 days out. He noticed the world the way she noticed numbers systematically, without conscious effort, in the background of everything else. On the third day, camped at a creek crossing that Silas Webb informed them marked roughly the halfway point, she and Ethan sat outside the camp while Silas slept, and the sky above them was so full of stars it seemed almost immodest. The kind of sky you only get far from towns and their light. "You've gone quiet," Ethan said. "I'm thinking," she said. "You're usually thinking. This is a different kind of quiet." She looked at him. He was right, and she found she had no immediate deflection prepared for that kind of precise observation. "I'm scared," she said. It came out simply, without the usual scaffolding she built around vulnerable things. He did not fill the silence immediately, which she had come to understand was one of his better qualities. "Of losing the case," he said eventually. "Of all of it." She looked at the stars. "Of winning and going back to Harlan Creek, where everyone has already decided who I am." Of this," she gestured vaguely. "Of whatever this is becoming." Another silence. "What do you think it's becoming?" he said. His voice was careful, and even and gave nothing away, but she had spent enough time in close quarters with Ethan Callahan to know that careful and even was not the same as unaffected. "I don't know," she said honestly. She stopped. Started again. "I've never been somewhere long enough to find out what happens next." "You could stay," he said. "Find out." She looked at him. He was looking at the stars, jaw set, and she could see in the line of his profile that he had said more than he intended and was not sure what to do with it, now that it was out. "I'm not saying," he began. "I know what you're saying," she said quietly. A long silence. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I've been alone 7 years, Clara." I've forgotten how to." He exhaled. "I'm better at fences than feelings." Always have been. Despite everything, the cold night, the hearing in 3 days, the weight of everything that had happened in the past weeks, Clara felt something she had not felt in, she didn't know how long. "Something light. That," she said, "is possibly the most honest thing I've ever heard a man say about himself." He looked at her. "Is that good?" "It's a start," she said. And for a moment, sitting beside a creek under a Montana sky full of more stars than either of them could count, they were just two people who had been alone for a long time and were tired of it. The moment was brief, but it was real. The territorial courthouse in Helena was a different world from Harlan Creek. It was large, formal, and full of men who wore their authority like a second coat, and Clara walked into it on the morning of the hearing with the document case under her arm and her back straight, and her face entirely composed. And she felt underneath the composure, below the carefully maintained surface, something that ran closer to terror than she had let herself acknowledge since the whole thing began. Because she understood now that she was here what was actually at stake. If they lost, if the evidence wasn't sufficient, if the judge sided with Reyes and Marsh, if Gerald Holt's money and influence proved stronger than the truth, Ethan would lose the North pasture. And once the water rights were gone from the north, the east portion would follow within a season. And after that, the entire ranch was a matter of time. She had come to this ranch with 17 cents. She had found something worth fighting for. She was not going to let it be taken. Reyes and Marsh were already present when they arrived, two men in city suits with a lawyer who looked like he had argued cases in Helena before and had the settled confidence of someone accustomed to winning. They glanced at the Callahan party once efficiently and then away. Their lawyer looked at Clara, at the document case. Then he leaned toward Reyes and said something quietly. Reyes looked at Clara again. She met his gaze directly. She watched him look away first. Good, she thought. The judge was a man named Beaumont who Silas had told her on the road, the reputation of being difficult to impress and impossible to mislead. He came to the bench on time, looked at both parties with the impartial exhaustion of someone who had seen every version of land disputes that the territory could produce, and said, "Let's begin." Silas presented their case methodically, the original 1,869 filing, the 1,871 survey correction, the specific boundary line cited in the opposing claim and its supersession by the corrected document. He spoke clearly and without theater, which Clara appreciated. Facts were more powerful than drama. Facts did not need costumes. The opposing lawyer made his argument with practiced fluency. He was good. Clara acknowledged that to herself without letting it become fear. He was skilled at framing the ambiguity, at suggesting that the 1,871 correction was itself open to interpretation, at making a deliberate falsification sound like a reasonable reading of complicated historical documents. He was good, but he had not read everything. When Silas presented Ignacio's letter, the eyewitness account from 1,872, signed and translated, describing the placement of the boundary markers with the specificity that only someone who had actually watched it happen could provide, the opposing lawyer went very still. He had not known about Ignacio. Clara had counted on that. She had counted on it because Gerald Holt, for all his money and his influence and his careful calculation, had never once in his life thought to ask what an old Mexican ranch hand had witnessed 11 years ago. He had looked at the documents and the money and the legal machinery and thought he understood the whole picture. He had not known about Ignacio because Ignacio was the kind of person people like Gerald Holt had trained themselves not to see. The judge read the letter twice. He asked Silas 3 questions about it, each precise, each aimed at a specific aspect of the document's verifiability. Silas answered them. Then the judge looked at the opposing counsel and said, "Counselor, the boundary line cited in your client's claim appears in a document dated 1,869. The 1,871 corrected survey, filed with this court and publicly recorded, establishes a different boundary. Is there a basis for your claim that does not rely on the superseded document?" The opposing counsel hesitated. 1 second. 2. Clara had learned in the weeks of working through the Callahan documents that hesitation in legal proceedings was never accidental. It was always the surface indication of something underneath, and what was underneath that hesitation, she knew, was the answer no. "We would request additional time to review," the opposing counsel began. "The documents in question have been publicly available since 1,871, Judge Beaumont said. "Additional time is not granted." He set down the letter. He looked at the papers before him. "This court finds the claim filed by Reyes and Marsh to be based upon a superseded document. The water rights to the creek on the north boundary of the Callahan property were legally established under the 1,871 corrected survey, and are not subject to the claim as filed." He looked at the opposing counsel with the measured gaze of a man who had not on the bench 15 years, without learning to recognize willful eight's misrepresentation when it came before him. "Furthermore," he said, "given that the superseding document was filed with this court and publicly recorded, this bench will be making a referral regarding the original filing to the Attorney General's office for review." The room was very quiet. Reyes had gone the particular color of a man who has just understood that the day is going considerably worse than expected. Ethan beside Clara was very still. She could feel, without looking at him, the particular quality of his stillness, not the stillness of relief but something more complicated, the stillness of a person absorbing something they had been afraid to hope for. "Mr. Callahan, Judge Beaumont said your water rights stand. This matter is concluded." He struck the gavel. Clara let out a breath she had been holding, she realized, for most of the last 3 weeks. Ethan turned to look at her. She turned to look at him. And what was in his face in that moment was not triumph. It was something quieter and more lasting than triumph. Something that looked. She thought, looking at him and feeling her own chest do something complicated and involuntary, like the face of a man who has just watched someone do something remarkable and is struggling to find the appropriate words for what he is feeling. "You did that," she said. "Ignacio did that." Silas did that. You found the error, he said. You knew what it meant. Ye stopped. Looked at Clara. Ethan, she said. I don't know how he stopped again. You don't have to, she said. Because she understood. She understood the particular frustration of having something large and real inside you and not the words for it, because she had lived her entire life in that condition. And she had learned that sometimes the absence of words was not inadequacy, but simply the sign that what you were feeling was bigger than language. He nodded. Once. And that went off. They rode back toward Harlan Creek the following morning, and on the second day of the return journey, something happened that none of them had anticipated. They stopped at a way station to water the horses, and there was a man there, a traveler heading east, who recognized Ethan from the county. They exchanged the brief pleasantries of people who know each other by reputation rather than personally, and the traveler said, almost in passing, as he was remounting, "Heard you had trouble with Holt." Heard it came out right. Word traveled faster than horses in the West. Always had. But then the man said something else, and it was this that stayed with Clara through the rest of the ride, that lodged in her chest and would not be dislodged. He said, "Heard it was your housekeeper who cracked it open." Woman who keeps your books. He said it matter-of-factly, without drama or commentary. Just heard it was the woman who keeps your books. She heard herself referred to by a stranger on a road, not as a burden or a charity case or a woman who'd been sold for flour or a schemer after a rich man's land, but as someone who had done something that mattered. She was quiet for a long time after that. Ethan noticed, of course he noticed, but he did not push. He rode beside her in the comfortable silence, some characteristic of the two of them for the past weeks, who have learned that they do not need to fill the space between them with noise. When they were an hour outside Harlan Creek, with the familiar landmarks of the country around the ranch beginning to appear, Clara said, "Ethan." "Yes. When we get back," she said, "there's going to be talk. There was talk before we left. It's going to be worse now. People are going to assume they're going to say." "I know what they're going to say," he said. "Does that bother you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Clara," he said, "I have spent 7 years not doing things, because I was worried about what would be said. I've been alone 7 years. I've sat in that house 7 years." He looked at her. "I'm tired of making decisions based on what people in Harlan Creek are going to say." She looked at the trail ahead. "That's not an answer," she said. "No," he agreed, "it's not." He was quiet for another beat. "Then no, it doesn't bother me. Is that clearer?" "Somewhat," she said. "Good," he said. "Then let's go home." And she noticed it the way she noticed everything that mattered, quietly and completely, and without making a show of it, that he had said home. Not back. Not to the ranch. Home. And she thought, as Harlan Creek came into view across the summer plain, that she understood exactly what he meant by it. And that she was beginning carefully, not without fear, with both hands and eyes wide open, to mean the same thing. They arrived in Harlan Creek at late afternoon. They had not been back 10 minutes when Gerald Holt came out of his trading post and stood on the boardwalk across the street and looked at them. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Clara. He looked at the document case in her hands. He knew. She could see it in his face, the tight, controlled look of a man absorbing a loss he had not expected, recalculating, rearranging. He was not a man who gave up. She knew that. Gerald Holt did not become what he was by accepting setbacks as final. He would try again. She knew it. She met his gaze across the summer street. She did not look away, and he was the one for the second time, in a way she had not planned but was beginning to expect, who looked away first. Ethan, beside her, said nothing, but she felt him beside her, solid and deliberate, and she understood that he had seen it too, and that he had positioned himself not in front of her but beside her. Which was, she was learning the difference between a man who protected you and a man who stood with you. She turned away from Gerald Holt's storefront. She looked at the ranch road that led east. She looked at the late summer afternoon laying itself out across the country in long golden light. And she thought, with a certainty that surprised her by its completeness, that the woman who had stood in this street 5 weeks ago, with a worn leather bag and 17 cents, had no idea what was coming. She had thought she was surviving. She was, in fact, beginning. And the most dangerous part of everything, the hardest part, the part that required more courage than the courthouse or the crowd or any of the rest of it, was still ahead. Because Gerald Holt had not finished, and what he was planning next would force a choice that no legal document could settle, and no court could decide a choice that would come down, finally and completely, to what each of them was willing to risk for the thing they had been building, without quite admitting they were building it. Clara Whitfield had been quiet for 24 years. What happened next would require her to be something she had never been permitted to be. Loud Gerald Holt moved fast. Clara had expected him to. She had told herself on the ride back from Helena that he would move fast, that a man like Gerald Holt did not absorb a public legal defeat and sit quietly with it. She had prepared herself for the next move. She had not prepared herself for what the next move actually was. It came 3 days after they returned to Harland Creek, on a Tuesday morning when the summer heat was already pressing down before 8 o'clock, and the ranch was in the full rhythm of its daily work. Clara was at the desk in the office, reconciling the July accounts, when she heard hoofbeats in the yard, multiple horses, moving fast, and then Ethan's voice, and then another voice she did not recognize. She set down her pen. She went to the window. There were 3 men in the yard. Ethan stood facing them, and even from a distance she could read the set of his shoulders, controlled, braced, the posture of a man who has seen trouble coming and is not going to let it see him flinch. She was out the door before she had decided to move. The man doing the talking was short and broad, and wore a badge on his coat that caught the morning light, a county deputy named Harlan. She had seen twice in town, a man she had assessed as not stupid but biddable. The kind of official who went where the money pointed. Complaint filed with the county recorder's office, the deputy was saying as Clara came off the porch. Alleging fraudulent management of accounts and misappropriation of ranch funds. Ethan's jaw was set. That's absurd. Maybe, the deputy said. Still got to follow up on a formal complaint. Who filed it? Clara said. Both men looked at her. The deputy looked at Ethan first, the automatic deference of a man checking whether a woman's question was authorized, and then, reading Ethan's expression, looked back at Clara. Complaint was filed by Mr. Gerald Holt, he said. On behalf of several Harlan Creek business owners who have concerns about the financial practices of this ranch. Clara looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at Clara. Between them, in the space of that look, passed a complete conversation, recognition, anger, and the rapid tactical assessment of what this meant and what it required. You're welcome to see the accounts, Clara said. She turned to the deputy with the measured calm of someone who is furious and has decided that fury is not useful right now. All of them. Every ledger from February to present reconciled and documented. You're welcome to bring anyone you like to examine them. She paused. Would you like to come in? The deputy hesitated. He had come expecting resistance. She could see it in the way he recalibrated, the slight awkwardness of a man whose prepared script had been bypassed. Yes, he said. I suppose that would be— Come in, Clara said. She walked back into the house. She heard the deputy follow her. She heard Ethan tell the other 2 men to wait in the yard, and then his boots on the porch, steps behind her, and she was already at the office door when he came through the front. He caught her arm gently as she reached for the ledger shelf. Clara, he said quietly. He's trying to scare us, she said. He wants us to look guilty by fighting it. We're not going to fight it. We're going to show everything. She pulled the first ledger. Every number, every transaction, every penny accounted for. She looked at Ethan. I haven't made an error in these books. Not one. He held her gaze for a moment. I know, he said. Then let me work. He let go of her arm. She set the ledgers on the desk. She spent the next 2 hours walking the deputy through every account in the Callahan Ranch records, beginning with the February reconstruction and ending with the previous week's entries. She explained the reconciliation process, the tracking of receipts against deliveries, the correction of the historical netting error, all of it, clearly, without defensiveness, the way you explain something to someone when you have nothing to hide. The deputy took notes. He was not, she had been right about this, stupid. He followed the numbers. He asked reasonable questions. And she could see, in the way his expression shifted as the morning progressed, that he had expected to find something and was not finding it. When she finished, he closed his notebook. "I don't see any issue," he said. "No," Clara said. "You wouldn't," he stood. "I'll report back to the county recorder that the complaint appears to be without foundation." "I'd appreciate that," Ethan said from the doorway, where he had stood the entire time without speaking, watching. The deputy left. The yard cleared. And then it was just the two of them in the office with the summer morning pressing against the window, and Ethan looked at Claire and said, "He's going to keep doing this." "Yes," she said. "He's going to find another angle." "Another complaint." "Yes," she said again. "He is." She set the ledger back in its place on the shelf. Straightened it. The small, precise gesture of someone organizing their thoughts alongside their materials. Gerald Holt is a man who doesn't accept outcomes that weren't his idea. We took something from him. Not just the water rights claim, we cost him credibility with the Attorney General's office, and that's going to cost him money, and men like him don't forget that. Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "So what do we do?" Clara turned to face him. "We stop waiting for him to find the next angle," she said, "and we find it first." She had been thinking about Aldous Pemberton. She had been thinking about him since the morning she had mentioned his name at the kitchen table, since the moment she had said it and seen the name land in Ethan's face in a way that told her it had not landed on unfamiliar ground. She asked about it that evening. They were sitting on the porch after supper, which had become their habit on summer evenings, the two of them in the chairs Ethan had built years ago and never taken inside, the work of the day finished, the ranch going quiet around them. It was the part of the day Clara had come to love most, partly because it was genuinely peaceful, and partly because Ethan was, in the evenings, more likely than at any other time to say things that came from somewhere honest. "Pemberton," she said. "You recognize the name when I said it." That first morning, Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He's connected to Holt," he said. "Has been for years. Business arrangements, what exactly they are, I've never been able to pin down, but anyone who deals with Holt for long enough ends up hearing Pemberton's name." He paused. "He ruined your business. He destroyed my reputation," Clara said. "Which in a town like Harlan Creek is essentially the same thing." "Did you keep records from when you were working for him?" Clara looked at him. "I kept everything," she said. And she watched his face as she said it, watched the recognition move across it, the particular expression of a man who has just realized that the woman sitting beside him is several moves ahead of where he thought she was. She had kept everything, because she had known, even at the time, that a man like Aldous Pemberton was the kind of man you documented. She had not known exactly what she would do with the documentation. She had carried it through 3 moves and 2 years of barely surviving, and the morning in Gerald Holt's trading post, a bundle of papers in the bottom of the worn leather bag, waiting for a day that might never come. That day, she was beginning to think, might be arriving. "Where are they?" "In my room," she said. "Under the floorboard." He looked at her. "You put documents under the floorboard," he said. "You put documents in a lockbox under a floorboard," she said. Something happened in his face that was unmistakably, finally, completely a smile. It lasted only a moment, but it was real, unguarded, surprised out of him, and it transformed his face in a way that made her briefly forget what they had been talking about. "Fair point," he said. She looked back at the summer evening. Her heart was doing something she was choosing not to examine too closely. "I need to look at them again," she said. "The Pemberton records. And then I need to talk to Silas Webb. I'll ride into town with you tomorrow, Ethan said. You don't need to, I know, he said. I want to. She looked at him. He was looking at the darkening sky, his profile composed and steady, and she thought not for the first time and with increasing frequency that Ethan Callahan was a man who meant exactly what he said and said exactly what he meant, and that she had lived 24 years in a world where that was so rare as to be almost theoretical. All right, she said. All right, he said. And they sat in the summer evening until the stars came out, not speaking much, and it was enough. The Pemberton records were more than she remembered. She spread them on the office desk that night, after Ethan had gone to his room, and she went through them with the same systematic attention she had brought to the Callahan accounts. And what she found in the careful documentation of a 20-year-old girl who had known something was wrong, and had written everything down, what she found was a pattern. Not just errors, not just the single instance of the ruined business that had cost her everything. A pattern. Pemberton had done it before. She could see it in the records, transactions that didn't match, credits that moved in ways that only made sense if you assumed money was going somewhere it wasn't being reported going. She had been too young 2 years ago to understand fully what she was looking at. She understood it now. She sat at the desk at midnight with the summer cicadas singing outside and the lamp burning low, and she understood that what she had in front of her was not just evidence of what had happened to her. It was evidence of something considerably larger. She sat with that for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and started making notes. Silas Webb looked at her notes the following morning with the expression of a man who is carefully managing his reaction to something larger than he expected. You understand what you're saying, he said. I do, Clara said. You're saying Pemberton has been running fraudulent accounts based on this. He looked at the dates. At least 4 years, at least, she said. Possibly longer. I only have records going back to when I started working for him. And you believe Holt is connected. I believe the money that was leaving Pemberton's accounts improperly was going somewhere, Clara said. And I believe that Holt and Pemberton have been in business together long enough that the question of where is worth asking. Silas set down the notes. He pressed his fingertips together. If you're right, he said slowly, this is considerably larger than a water rights claim. Yes, Clara said. If you're wrong, I'm not wrong, she said. I was wrong about what I was seeing 2 years ago because I didn't have enough context. I have the context now. She met his gaze. Look at the numbers, Silas. You'll see it. He looked at the numbers. Ethan sat beside Clara in silence, and she was aware of him in the way she was always aware of him, as a steady presence, a weight in the room that was not pressure but solidity. The particular feeling of someone who is there not to direct what you are doing, but to make sure you don't have to do it entirely alone. Silas looked up after 15 minutes. You're not wrong, he said. Something released in her chest. What do we do with it? Ethan said. We take it to the federal marshal's office in Helena, Silas said. This has gone past what the county can handle. Fraudulent accounts touching multiple businesses over multiple years, that's federal jurisdiction. He looked at Clara. You'd have to be willing to give a formal statement. Describe your time working for Pemberton, what you saw, what you documented. I know, she said. It'll be public, he said. There's no quiet way to do this. I know that, too, she said. Holt will push back. Hard. He's already pushing back, Ethan said. He sent a deputy to the ranch 3 days ago with a fraud complaint. There's no quiet option left. His voice was even. Let's make the noise count. Silas looked at the two of them, at Clara, with her careful documentation and her composed face, and the particular quality of steadiness that came from a person who has decided something and means it. And at Ethan, who had not said much this morning, but whose silence was the opposite of absence, and he nodded. I'll draft the complaint, he said. Give me 2 days. Gerald Holt found out the same day Silas sent the draft to Helena. Clara did not know how the information pipelines of a small frontier town operated by mechanisms that defied full understanding, but she was in the dry goods store on Thursday afternoon when Frances Aldrich appeared at her elbow with an expression that was not, for the first time, hostile. It was something closer to uncertain. "I heard," Frances said, without preamble, "that you filed a complaint against Aldous Pemberton with the federal marshal." "A complaint has been filed, yes," Clara said carefully. Frances was quiet for a moment. Her hands were folded in front of her in the way she folded them when she was working through something uncomfortable. "Pemberton," she said, "handled accounts for my husband's business 3 years ago." Clara looked at her, and when he finished handling them, Frances continued, "Certain funds that should have been in our account were not." She paused. "My husband believed it was his own error. He spent 2 years blaming himself." Her voice tightened on the last sentence in a way that made it clear the 2 years had not been easy ones. "It wasn't his error," Clara said quietly. Frances looked at her directly, for the first time since the dry goods store confrontation weeks ago, and what was in her face was complicated, in a way that Clara recognized, because she had worn the same expression herself. The look of a person re-examining something they had decided, and finding that what they thought was bedrock was considerably less solid than they had believed. "No," Frances said. "I'm beginning to understand that." She was quiet for another moment. "I owe you an apology." Clara blinked. She had not expected that. "Mrs. Aldrich, I said things about you that were unkind and untrue," Frances said. "I said them because it was easy, and because Gerald Holt has a way of making his version of things seem like everyone's version. I'd like to correct that." She straightened. "If you'll let me." Clara looked at Frances Aldrich, at the 62-year-old woman who had been the social authority of Harlan Creek for 20 years and who was standing in the dry goods store in the summer heat, offering an apology to a girl she had publicly humiliated, and she thought about how small pride was ultimately. How little it weighed against the cost of carrying it. "I'll let you," Frances nodded once. "There are others," she said. "Others who may have been affected by Pemberton. If the federal marshal needs witnesses." "Silas Webb can tell you what would be useful," Clara said. Frances nodded again. She straightened her coat, and she walked away. Clara stood in the dry goods store for a moment, absorbing what had just happened, and then finished her purchases and walked out into the summer street where Ethan was waiting with the horses. He looked at her face. "Something happened," he said. "Frances Aldrich apologized to me," she said. He stared at her. "In public?" he said. "In the dry goods store," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Well, I'll be." The shift in Harlan Creek happened the way those shifts always did, not all at once, not with any single dramatic announcement, but gradually, the way a tide turns, in small increments that accumulate into something undeniable. The Aldous Pemberton complaint reached Helena. The federal marshal's office sent an investigator, a quiet, methodical man named Tate, who spent 4 days in Harlan Creek, asking questions and reading documents and saying very little about what he was finding, and his presence alone changed something in the town. Because people talked to him. Not just Clara, not just Silas. Not just Frances Aldrich with her husband's missing account funds. Other people, a rancher north of town who had noticed irregularities in contracts he'd signed through Pemberton, a widow who had been told her late husband's business had been worth considerably less than she'd believed, a shopkeeper who had dealt with Holt directly and had the nagging sense for years that the terms of their arrangement had been less favorable than they appeared. When people understood that someone was actually listening, and that what they said might matter, they talked. Clara had not anticipated how many people would talk. She sat in Silas Webb's office on the 4th day of Tate's visit and listened to a list of names that had come forward. And she felt something she had not felt before in this town, a kind of solidarity that she hadn't known was available, from people she hadn't known were watching. "Gerald Holt," Silas said, setting down his pen, "has been doing this for a long time." Long enough that a great many people have their own small piece of what he's done. He looked at Clara. You gave them a place to bring it. I brought my own piece, Clara said. They brought theirs, yes. But someone had to go first. He looked at her over his spectacles. That was you. She thought about the morning in Gerald Holt's trading post, her mother's voice, describing her to a man behind a counter, the crowd that had turned to watch. The moment before Ethan's voice came from the back of the room, asking a single quiet question. She thought about how far that morning now seemed. And she thought about how none of the she had traveled from that morning to this office had been possible without choosing over and over again the harder thing. The staying instead of the leaving, the speaking instead of the silence. The fighting when every instinct she had built over 24 years told her to fold herself small and endure. She was done being small. What happens to Holt? She said. Holt is connected to Pemberton's accounts, Silas said. Tate confirmed it yesterday. The money that went missing from multiple clients went through a business arrangement between Holt and Pemberton. That is, let's say it is not accurately described in their filed documents. He paused. Holt is going to have a significant conversation with the federal marshal's office. And that conversation is going to be considerably less pleasant than anything he's managed so far. Clara nodded. She felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for 2 years, since the morning Pemberton told her she was incompetent, since the crowd believed him, since she had carried the knowledge of what she had seen without anyone to tell it to. She had not known, when she walked into Gerald Holt's trading post 5 weeks ago, that she was walking toward the thing that would finally let her put it down. Ethan was waiting outside Silas's office. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his hat tipped back, and he looked up when she came out with the expression he had, the one that gave nothing away on the surface but had. She had learned a great deal going on underneath. Well, he said. She told him. She told him about Pemberton, about Holt, about the connection Tate had confirmed, about the number of people who had come forward. She told it the way she told things, completely, efficiently, without theater. When she finished, Ethan was quiet. Then he said, "It's over." The immediate danger, she said carefully. Holt will be occupied for a long time. He won't be picking fights with neighboring ranches for the foreseeable future. But it's not just that, Ethan said. She looked at him. You came here 5 weeks ago, he said, with what was it? 17 cents. 17 cents, she confirmed. And a sack of flowers worth of determination, he said. She almost smiled. That's one way to put it. He pushed off from the wall. He looked at her directly, steadily, with the characteristic plainness of a man who has thought something through, and it is time to say it. Clara, he said, I have a question, and I'd like you to hear it out before you answer. She waited. You came to the ranch because there was nowhere else to go, he said. I know that. You took the job because you needed it, and you've done it well, better than I had any right to expect, better than I knew was possible. He paused. But I don't want you to stay because you need the work. Her chest was doing the complicated thing it had been doing, with increasing frequency around him. What do you want me to stay for, she said. He looked at her. Because I'd like you to, he said. Because the ranch is better with you in it. Because I am better with you in it. He stopped. I'm not saying this right. You're saying it fine, she said. I'm saying. He took a breath. Steadied himself the way she had seen him steady horses, not forcing, just waiting for the right moment. I'd like you to stay. Not as the housekeeper. Not as the bookkeeper. As he stopped again. As the person who locks the office door when she needs quiet and unlocks it when she wants company, and knows the difference without being told. As the person who checks on the horses before anyone asks. As the person, he looked at her, as someone who chooses to be here. Not because she has to. The summer street was quiet around them. Clara looked at Ethan Callahan, at the man who had stood in a crowd with his hat in his hands, and asked the question that changed everything, who had not once in 5 weeks asked her to be smaller than she was, who had stood beside her in a courthouse and on a road and on a porch under summer stars, slowly and against 24 years of evidence to the contrary, that being where she was might be something other than temporary. "Ethan," she said, "yes, I'm going to need you to be more specific." Something flashed across his face, caught off guard, recalibrating, and then he laughed. A real laugh, surprised and genuine, the first one she had heard from him fully, and it was so unexpected and so real that it disarmed her completely. "All right," he said, when he recovered. He was still almost smiling. More specific. He reached up and took off his hat. The gesture she had first noticed in the street 5 weeks ago, the hat in his hands, the particular courtliness of it. "Clara Whitfield, would you consider marrying me?" The summer street, the heat, the sound of the town going about its business around two people who had both been alone for so long that the word between them had the weight of something enormous. Clara looked at him. "That's still not very specific," she said. "I'm working on it," he said. "Give me a moment." She waited. "I've been alone 7 years," he said. "I was alone before that, in the ways that matter, for longer than I've known how to admit. And in 5 weeks he stopped. Started again. You have made me remember what it feels like to want to come home. Not to the ranch, not to the buildings, to the person who might be in them." He held her gaze. "That's what I'm asking you to be. Not because you need the roof. Because I pause smaller, more honest than anything before it. Because I would like to be someone's home, and I think you would too." Clara's throat was tight. She thought about a room with a window that faced the mountains, and a lock on the inside of the door, and the first morning she had woken up and pressed her hand flat against the wall and found it solid. She thought about an accounting ledger with errors anyone could fix, and a man who had brought it to her without explaining what it was for. She thought about sitting on a porch in the summer evening, doing nothing particular, and how that had been, she realized, the thing she had needed most for years. Not to be useful. "Just I would," she said quietly. "I would like to be someone's home." He looked at her. "Yes?" he said. "Yes," she said. He put his hat back on. He held out his hand. She took it, and they stood in the summer street in Harlan Creek, Montana, where 5 weeks ago she had been sold for flour, and where she had come back from Helena with a man beside her and a court ruling in her hands. And neither of them said anything else for a long moment because there was nothing that needed to be said. The town moved around them, and for the first time in her life, Clara Whitfield felt it completely, without reservation, without the waiting for the other shoe to fall, the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because she had been placed there, because she had chosen it. And so had he. The news moved through Harlan Creek in the particular way of small towns, fast, comprehensive, and with a degree of editorial embellishment that Clara chose not to worry about. By the following morning, everyone knew. By that afternoon, people she had never spoken to were nodding at her in the street with something that looked remarkably like respect. It was not the town's approval she had needed. She understood that. She had never needed the town's approval. She had needed her own, the internal recognition, earned through the hardest 5 weeks of her life, that she was not what her mother's desperation had tried to make her, not what Gerald Holt's calculations had tried to reduce her to. Not what 24 years of surviving had convinced her was her permanent condition. She was Clara Whitfield. She kept accounts and checked horses for stone bruises, and had taught herself law from library books, and had carried evidence in a worn leather bag for 2 years, waiting for a day that came. She was not someone's burden. She was not a transaction. She was not a quiet, useful woman in the background of someone else's story. She was the woman who had cracked open Gerald Holt's scheme and brought the federal marshal to Harlan Creek and had stood in a courthouse in Helena and known, with the certainty that only comes from being completely and absolutely right, that the numbers did not lie. She was the woman Ethan Callahan had asked to be his home. And she had said yes, not because she had to, because she wanted to. And that, in the end, in the deepest and most essential sense, was the only reason that had ever mattered. The wedding was set for the last Saturday of August. Clara had not wanted a large ceremony. She had said so plainly when Ethan asked, sitting at the kitchen table the morning after he had proposed in the summer street, while she was making coffee and he was pretending to read the ranch ledger he had already read twice. Small, she said. Just the people who were actually there. There where, he said. There for any of it, she said. The people who showed up when it mattered. He nodded. Ignacio, she agreed. Dewey. Cal. She paused. Silas Webb. Arthur Finch. Francis Aldrich, he said carefully. Clara poured the coffee, set his cup in front of him. Thought about a woman in a dry goods store who had stood in front of her and said the words she had needed to say. Francis Aldrich, she said. He looked up at her. Anyone else? She looked at the cup in her hands. My sister Elsa, she said quietly. If she wants to come. He said nothing, but she felt him. Across the table, make room for that, for the complicated, unresolved, still tender thing that was her family, without pushing at it or trying to tidy it into something simpler than it was. That was, she thought, one of the things she had come to understand about Ethan Callahan. He did not try to make difficult things easier by pretending they were simple. He just sat beside them with you. I'll send word to Elsa, she said. All right, he said. He went back to the ledger he wasn't reading. She went back to the coffee she wasn't drinking, and the summer morning settled around them in the way it had begun to settle, as something that belonged to both of them, ordinary and irreplaceable. Elsa came. She arrived 2 days before the wedding on a borrowed horse, 17 years old and nervous in the way of someone who has been told they may not be welcome, and has come anyway because something stronger than fear told them to. Clara saw her riding in from the porch and went down the steps and across the yard without hesitating. Elsa dismounted. She was taller than Clara remembered. The last time she had seen her properly was 3 years ago, before the Pemberton disaster. Before everything, and she had their mother's eyes and their father's jaw, and the particular combination of those features that had always made Clara feel, when she looked at her sister, that she was looking at a photograph of something she had loved before she understood what love was. They stood facing each other in the summer yard. You came, Clara said. You asked, Elsa said, as though it were simple, as though 17 years old and borrowed horses and the complicated weight of what their mother had done were nothing at all compared to the fact that her sister had asked. Clara pulled her into her arms. Elsa held on. They stood in the yard of the Callahan ranch in the August heat and held on to each other, and neither of them spoke for a long time, because the things between them were not the kind that fit neatly into sentences, and they both understood that. When they separated, Elsa looked at the ranch house, at the horses in the pasture, at Ethan, who had appeared at a discreet distance and was making a determined study of a fence post that did not require studying. Is that him? That's him, Clara said. He's tall. Elsa watched him for a moment. He looks like he's pretending not to look over here. He's polite, Clara said. Elsa considered this. That's better than the alternative, she said, which was, Clara thought, feeling something ease in her chest, almost exactly the right thing to say. She took her sister's arm. She walked her to the house. And Ethan came away from the fence post. He didn't need to inspect and followed them in, and that evening the three of them ate supper, together with Ignacio and Rooster and the others, and there was more noise at the Callahan table than there had been since Clara arrived, and she sat in the middle of it and thought this exact thing. The noise and the food and the people who had chosen to be here was what she had been surviving toward without knowing it. The morning of the wedding, something happened that she had not anticipated. She was in her room, still with the east-facing window and the lock she had used every night for 2 months finishing her hair, when she heard a knock at the door that was not Elsa's knock. Elsa knocked the way young people knocked, quick, light, slightly impatient. This knock was slower. Clara opened the door. Her mother was standing in the hallway. She had not been invited. Clara had not sent word. She had made a deliberate, considered decision not to, because the question of her mother was not resolved, and she had not wanted it unresolved in the middle of the day she was trying to build for herself. And yet, Ruth Whitfield was standing in the hallway of the Callahan ranch house in her church dress, the one she wore for the rare occasions that required dressing up, holding something in her hands that she pressed forward as soon as the door opened, because she was clearly afraid that if she didn't do it immediately, she would not do it at all. It was a quilt, the fabric worn soft with washing. Clara recognized the squares of it, the specific colors, the stitching that she knew better than almost anything in the world, because she had watched those hands make it, years ago, when she was very small. It was the quilt from her grandmother's house, the one her grandmother had made. The one Clara had assumed was gone lost in the years of moves and hardship and the particular carelessness of poverty. "I kept it," Ruth said. Her voice was not steady. "When Mama died. I kept it for you, because I always meant she stopped. I always meant to give it to you, when you had something to put it on." Clara looked at the quilt. She looked at her mother. Ruth was not a woman who cried easily. She was not crying now, but the control it was taking was visible in the lines of her face, in the way she held herself. "You came," Clara said. "Elsa told me," Ruth said. "I know you didn't," she exhaled. "I know I don't have a right to be here." "No," Clara said. Ruth flinched. "But you're here," Clara said. "And you brought this." She reached out and took the quilt from her mother's hands. The fabric was exactly as she remembered, soft and worn and smelling faintly of cedar and old houses, and the specific scent of a woman who had died when Clara was 12 and who had been. Now that Clara looked back at it, with the clarity of distance, the last person who had held her, without asking anything in return. She pressed the quilt to her chest for a moment. Then she looked at her mother. "Come to the wedding," she said. "Sit in the back. Don't say anything to Ethan unless he speaks to you first." She paused. "And Mama." Ruth looked at her. "This is the only morning I have like this," Clara said. "Don't make it about anything except that." Ruth nodded. Once, quickly, the way she agreed to things when she did not trust herself to speak. She turned to go. "And thank you," Clara said, "for keeping it." Ruth stopped. She did not turn around, but her shoulders, which had been braced and tight, dropped slightly. Released something. Then she walked down the hall. Clara closed the door. She stood holding the quilt, and she allowed herself exactly 2 minutes, she counted them, old habit, to feel everything that was in her chest. All of it. The grief and the anger and the love that had refused to die no matter how many reasonable grounds it had been given to, and the strange, incomplete, unfinished mercy that was all she had to offer and all her mother had asked for. Then she set the quilt on the bed. She finished her hair. And she went to get married. The ceremony was held in the yard of the ranch under the August sky. A traveling minister named Howell performed it, a gentle man who asked no unnecessary questions and conducted the words with quiet dignity and did not extend the proceedings beyond what was needed. Clara stood beside Ethan in the morning light and looked at the people around them, Ignacio with his hat in his hands, and his expression composed it into something that was doing a great deal of work, containing what was underneath it. Rooster, who had dressed formally and was vibrating with suppressed emotion. Dewey and Cal standing straight, Silas Webb, Arthur Finch. Frances Aldrich, who had brought flowers from her garden and pressed them into Clara's hands that morning, without comment. Elsa at the front, who was absolutely not crying and was doing an extremely poor job of pretending otherwise. And in the back, slightly separate, her mother, holding her hands together in front of her. Watching. Clara looked at Ethan. He was looking at her with the expression she had catalogued over 2 months, the steady, direct, complicated gaze of a man who meant every word he said and was about to say words he meant with everything in him. Minister Howell spoke the words. Ethan spoke his, Clara spoke hers. And when it was done, when Minister Howell said the thing that made it official and real and irreversible, Ethan reached up and touched her face, gently, with the deliberateness of someone doing something they have been thinking about for a long time and are not rushing. And he looked at her the way he had looked at the ranch that first morning. She had compared it to not the performed admirations of someone who wanted something, but the settled, uncomplicated gaze of a person looking at what they love. "Mrs. Callahan," he said quietly. She had not expected that to hit her the way it did. She had been Clara Whitfield her whole life, Clara, who kept the accounts and checked the horses and carried documents in a worn leather bag and survived by being necessary and had never once been able to answer the question of what she wanted with anything except a long silence. Mrs. Callahan, a name that meant she had chosen someone and been chosen back. "Mr. Callahan," she said. And he smiled the full, real, unguarded smile she had first seen in the street outside Silas Webb's office, and she thought she could learn to do a great deal for that smile, and then she thought that she did not need to do anything for it. That it was freely given, and that was still new enough to take her breath away. The federal marshal's investigation into Gerald Holt and Aldous Pemberton concluded 6 weeks after the wedding. Marshal Tate rode out to the ranch on a Tuesday morning to inform them personally, which Clara had not expected and which told her something about the kind of man Tate was. He sat at the kitchen table where Clara had first looked at Ethan over an accounting ledger in the dark of early morning, lifetimes ago, and he told them what had been found. Pemberton had been running a scheme for 6 years. Money removed from client accounts through falsified reconciliation entries, the same technique, Clara noted with grim recognition, that she had first seen signs of during her 3 months working for him. The money had moved through a series of business arrangements into accounts associated with Gerald Holt. The total figure Tate named made Ethan's jaw tighten visibly. "Pemberton has agreed to testify," Tate said, "in exchange for reduced charges." "And Holt?" Ethan said. Tate looked at him steadily. "Gerald Holt was arrested in Helena yesterday morning. He'll stand trial before the territorial court in the spring." A pause. "He will not be returning to Harlan Creek in any capacity that matters." The kitchen was quiet. Clara looked at her hands on the table. She thought about a trading post counter and a list of provisions and a woman who had stood there describing her daughter like livestock. She thought about the crowd that had turned. She thought about the night she had sat at this desk, going through Pemberton's records, and understood what she was looking at, and felt for the first time the particular power of knowing the truth when everyone around you has decided to prefer a convenient lie. She thought about 17 cents. "There are multiple claimants for restitution," Tate continued, "including several Harlan Creek residents. Including," he paused. "Including you, Miss Clara, Mrs. Callahan," he corrected himself. The business Pemberton destroyed had documented value. That documentation supports a restitution claim. Clara looked at him. She had not thought about that. She had not allowed herself to think about it, had kept her attention on the present and the immediate and not on what the past might owe her, because in her experience the past owed everyone a great deal and paid out very rarely. "How substantial?" Tate named a figure. Clara went very still. It was not a fortune, but it was 2 years of what her business had earned before Pemberton destroyed it. It was the seamstress shop that should have existed and didn't. It was her grandmother's quilt in monetary form, the accounting of what had been taken finally set right. "You don't have to decide now," Tate said. "The process takes time." "I'll file," Clara said. Both men looked at her. "I'll file," she said again. "Not because I need the money. Because the record should be correct." She held Tate's gaze. "Someone should write down what he actually did. To me. To all of them. Someone should say it out loud where it can't be taken back." Tate looked at her for a long moment. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Someone should. The twist came from a direction Clara had not been watching. It was Ignacio who told her, on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after Tate's visit, When she was in the barn checking on the gray mare that had been her horse for the 6-day ride to Helena and had since become, through a process neither she nor Ethan had formally acknowledged, her horse in the permanent sense. Ignacio came in with the careful step of a man who has something to say and is working out how to say it. "There's a woman in town," he said, "staying at the boarding house on Miller Street." Clara looked at him. "Who? She arrived yesterday," he said. "She's asking about the ranch, about Mr. Callahan." He paused. "About you. What kind of questions?" "The kind," Ignacio said, choosing his words with the precision of someone who knows how much weight they carry, that a person asks when they already know the answers and are deciding whether to act on them. Clara went still. "Who is she?" He looked at her steadily. "Her name," he said, "is Margaret Callahan." The barn was very quiet. The gray mare shifted. The summer sounds continued outside. Everything was exactly as it had been 10 seconds ago, and yet Clara felt the ground reorganize itself beneath her in the way it did when something fundamental changes and the world has not yet caught up with it. Margaret. The woman Ethan had married, the woman who had left. The woman whose letter he had read so many times over 7 years that he could recite its reasoning, "I don't want to be second to anything that can't love me back." She was in Harlan Creek. She had arrived the day after the word of Holt's arrest had spread. Clara understood that timing immediately. The news had traveled. The news always traveled. And somewhere, in whatever life Margaret had built after she left a Montana ranch for a different kind of existence, the news had reached her that the man she had left was no longer alone. And she had come. Clara set down the brush she had been using on the mare's coat. She was aware that her hands were steady, and she was aware that this was a conscious effort, and she was aware that the stability she was maintaining on the surface had a great deal more motion under it than was visible. She had not even in her worst moments of fear and uncertainty, even in the nights when she lay awake in the east-facing room, examining every possible way this could still go wrong, she had not imagined this particular shape of wrong. "Does Ethan know?" "She's not yet," Ignacio said. "I came to you first." She absorbed that, the loyalty in it. "The care. Thank you," she said. She put the brush down. She walked out of the barn, and across the yard, and into the house, and found Ethan in the office, doing what he always did in the morning, working through the accounts she had taught him to read properly. Because she had been teaching him and he had been learning, and this was one of the small, ordinary things that had become part of the texture of their days together. He looked up. He read her face. "What happened?" he said. She told him. She told it in 12 words. "Margaret is in Harlan Creek. She arrived yesterday. She's asking questions." Ethan's face went through things. She watched it happen, watched the past move through him, the way weather moves through open country, visible and complete, nothing hidden by geography. She saw the old wound the one 7 years had not fully closed. She saw the calculation of what this meant. She saw something else, underneath all of it, something she focused on and held. He was looking at her, not at the window, not at the middle distance, where people look when they are retreating into their own thinking. "At her," he said. "You don't have to," she began. "I'm going to say something," he said, "and I need you to hear it before you decide what to do with it." She waited. "Margaret left," he said. "She left because she was right to leave. I was not. I did not know then how to make a person feel like the most important thing. I know that. I've known it for 7 years." He held her gaze. "But I have spent 7 years learning it, and I have spent the last 3 months with you understanding what it actually looks to practice it." He paused. "I am not going back. Not because of obligation. Because I don't want to. Because what I have now is what I should have been capable of then, and I was not. And I am sorry for that. And I have been sorry for 7 years. But sorry is not the same as returning to it." Clara looked at him. At this man who had reached into a crowd 2 months ago and asked the question no one else thought to ask, and had not once since then asked her to be anything other than entirely herself. "She may want something else," Clara said carefully. "She may not be here to I'll talk to her, Ethan said. If that's what she needs. If she came because she has something she needs to say, I'll hear her. He looked at Clara. But I'll go as a man who has a wife and a ranch and a life he chose. I'm not going as the man who wrote apologies in his head for 7 years. He paused. Is that all right? It was a real question he was asking because it was her answer that mattered to him. Yes, she said. That's all right. He put down the pen. He put on his hat. He went into town. And Clara sat in the office with the summer morning around her, and the ranch sounds outside, and her grandmother's quilt on the bed down the hall, and 2 months of ledgers she had reconciled correctly, and she waited. He was back before noon. She heard the horse in the yard and did not go to the window, because she had decided while she waited, in the some fiction can learn that some things cannot be rushed, that she would let him come to her. He came through the front door. He came to the office doorway. She looked up. His face was clear, not the controlled blankness of someone managing something difficult, but the genuine clarity of a man who has done something hard and is at peace with how it went. She's leaving tomorrow, he said. Clara waited. She came because she heard about Holt. She heard about you. He leaned against the doorframe. She wanted to see for herself, I think, whether it was real. And Clara said, I told her about the accounting ledger, he said. The first morning, the way you sat down and told me everything that was wrong with it and how to fix it and that you'd want to renegotiate the wage in 3 months. He paused. I told her about Helena, about Tate, about Francis Aldrich in the dry goods store. What did she say? He was quiet for a moment. She said she was glad, he said. She said he stopped. She said she'd always hoped I'd figure it out. How to be someone's home. He looked at Clara steadily. She said it looked like I had. Clara set down her pen. She was quiet for a moment with everything that was in, that the 7 years in the letter, and the man who had built walls around himself, and the woman who had left because she could not live inside them, and the different woman who had come in through a different door entirely, and found that the walls were already coming down. She was right to tell you, Clara said, about being second to something that couldn't love her back. I know, he said. I'm not willing to be second, she said. I know, he said again. You've never been second to anything since the moment you sat down at that desk. He crossed the room. He stood in front of her, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her, directly, completely, without decoration. You're not second to anything, Clara. You are the thing everything else is organized around. He paused. That's new for me, but it's true. She looked up at him. Her heart was doing the thing it did. Good, she said. He reached down, he took her hand. She stood, and they went out together onto the porch of the ranch house where they lived, in the August afternoon of the summer that had changed everything. And Harlan Creek was 6 miles away, and the mountains were where they always were, and the horses were in the pasture, and Ignacio was repairing something at the fence line, and somewhere down the road, Elsa was probably riding back to town, and Ruth Whitfield was in the house where she had always been, carrying the weight she had always carried, and all of that was real and unresolved and true. But this was also real. This, the two of them on this porch in this afternoon, with everything behind them and everything ahead, was as real as anything that had ever happened to either of them. Months later, when the summer had given way to autumn, and the autumn to the first edge of winter, Clara sat at the desk in the office on a Saturday morning and finished the quarterly accounts and closed the ledger and looked out the window at the country she had come to know, the way you come to know a face you love by long attention, by the accumulation of ordinary moments, by the understanding that familiar is not the same as boring, and that ordinary is not the same as small. Elsa was at the ranch for the weekend, sleeping late the way 17-year-olds did, taking up space in the kitchen with the unconscious ease of someone who had been told she was welcome and had believed it. Ignacio was in the barn. Rooster was somewhere, being Rooster. And Ethan was outside, doing the 1,000 small necessary things that kept a working ranch running. and in approximately 40 minutes, he would come through the back door and take off his hat and pour himself coffee and say something brief and practical about whatever needed to be done in the afternoon. And she would tell him what she had found in the courts, and he would listen with the focused attention he brought to everything she said, and they would figure it out together. This was what she had. Not the grand version she might have imagined if she had been the kind of girl who imagined grand versions of things. Not rescued from poverty by a handsome man on a white horse, not transformed by love into someone unrecognizable, not elevated by marriage into something she hadn't been before. Just this, a room of her own with a lock she chose when to use. Work that mattered and that she was genuinely good at. A man who had meant what he said about wanting a partner, and was daily, imperfectly, honestly, living that intention. A sister who came on weekends. A community that had revised its opinion of her, not because she had become wealthy or beautiful or socially useful, but because she had done something true, and most people, given the chance, recognized the truth when they finally had to look at it directly. And underneath all of it, the thing that had changed most completely, the thing she noticed every morning when she woke in the room with the east-facing window. She was not afraid, not of the day, not of what it might require of her. Not of whether she was enough or too much, or the wrong shape for the space she occupied. She had been afraid for 24 years. She had been afraid of being unwanted, of being discarded, of being reduced to what she cost rather than what she was worth, of loving something and having it confirm every terrible thing she had believed about her own dispensability. She was not afraid anymore, not because the world had stopped being capable of cruelty. Not because Gerald Holt had been arrested, or Francis Aldrich had apologized, or her mother had brought a quilt. Those things were real, but they were not the source. The source was simpler and deeper and more hers. She knew now what she was. She was the woman who had read an accounting ledger and found the error and known what it meant. She was the woman who had carried evidence in a worn leather bag for 2 years because she understood, even then, that the truth did not expire. She was the woman who had stood in a courthouse in Helena and felt the particular power of being completely and absolutely right. She was the woman who had sat in a crowd's judgment and not flinched. Who had met her mother in a street and offered what she had. Who had waited in a barn while her husband drove into town to meet his past and had trusted genuinely, without forcing it, that he would come back. She was Clara Callahan, and she had built this not alone. Not without help, not without a man who had asked the right question at the right moment, and had been asking the right questions daily, ever since. But she had built it, with her own hands and her own mind and her own will, from the raw materials of a life that had tried very hard to convince her she deserved nothing better than to be traded for a sack of flour. The back door opened. Boots on the kitchen floor, the sound of a hat on the peg. Coffee poured. "Accounts look right," Ethan said from the kitchen doorway. "Accounts look right," she said. "Good." He came into the office and set a cup of coffee on the desk beside her. He looked at the closed ledger, then at her face. He had always been able to read her face. "You all right?" "Better than all right," she said. He studied her for a moment with the steady attention she had come to understand was not assessment, but something closer to care, the specific attentiveness of a person for whom another person has become the thing they watch most carefully. Not out of worry, but out of the deep, daily investment of a man who has decided that this woman's inner weather matters to him. "Good," he said again. He sat down in the chair across from her, the chair where she had first opened his ledger, a lifetime ago, and told him what was wrong with it and how to fix it. He drank his coffee, she drank hers. Outside, the ranch went about its business. Inside, the morning was theirs. And Clara Whitfield, Clara Callahan, who had arrived in the summer of 1882 with 17 cents and a worn leather bag, and a mother who had tried to trade her for provisions, looked at the man across the desk and at the life inside these walls and at the woman she had become inside it, and understood, finally and completely and without reservation, that she had not been waiting to be rescued. She had been on her way here all along. She just hadn't known it yet. And now she did, and that knowledge, hard-won and entirely her own, was the one thing in this world that no one could ever take from her, because she had not been given it. She had earned it, one choice at a time,